Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Pascal, and I'll be hosting the first online live panel questioning the sustainability of the concept of adoption. In this panel, we will be discussing the concept of ownership, development of the market of babies through history, and the psychological damage commonly inflicted to adoptees. If you're participating through Google Hangouts, we have activated the Q&A section where you'll be able to write questions to our panelists. If you aren't sure of how that function works, you can also simply send your questions by email to asifborn2@gmail.com. So that's asifborn2@gmail.com. The panel will go on for 45 minutes, and an additional 15 minutes will be allocated to answer questions related to today's topic. So let's jump right straight to it. Social practitioner, social worker practitioner, and from the School of Human Services and Social Work from Griffith University of Queensland in Australia, Patricia Franek, and I'll present her.
Hi, Pascal.
How are you?
Hi, Pascal. Good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Social worker, practitioner, member of the Committee of Management of the Victorian Adoption Network for Information Self-Help, and adoptee from the forced adoption era in Australia, Penny McKeeson. So I'll present to everyone. Hi there.
Hi everyone. Thank you for having me, Pascal.
No worries. So, American psychotherapist, adoptee from the black market, and author of Adoption Healing, A Path to Recovery, Joe Soul, who will be with us without camera today because his camera is not working too well.
Hello, thank you for having me here.
No problem. Australian intercountry adoptee from Vietnam, founder of the former Intercountry Adoptee Support Network, Lynelle Long. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be involved.
Thanks. American mother from the baby scoop era, an adoptive mother of an intercountry transracial son, Pamela McRae.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. And last but not least, Australian intercountry adoptee from South Korea, Amy Ko.
Thanks, Pascal. Hi, everyone.
So welcome to all of our panelists. We'll jump into the subject of today. So the new Minister of Equality of Victoria State, amongst his new policies, I'll put myself in the camera, will be allowing homosexual couples to adopt. Being a homosexual myself, I found such news quite progressive, but I can't help myself to think that there is a fundamental flaw about all of this. Is it a right for anyone, heterosexual or queer, to own a child? And furthermore, will the increase of demand of babies stimulate corruption? So I'd like to start with the first question with you, Dr. Franek. I'd like to know if it's even a right for anyone to own a child.
Pascal, two things there. There is no such thing as the right to parent in international law. The rights from the UN Convention is about the rights of children through the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the United Nations Convention on Intercountry Adoption. So there is, in fact, no right to parent. There's only the rights of children, and that certainly states very clearly that children can't be owned.
Yeah. Thank you. And so, do you have anything to add, Penny?
Yes, that children are not chattel, that they should not be used they should not be procured, they should not be used to legitimise, other people's political ideologies or struggles, and they should not be used to legitimise dubious third-party reproductive methods. The rights that are conferred to children should be paramount, and it's an onus on everybody else to uphold those rights because they are the most vulnerable in our society.
So we've come up to a lot of, because we've all been part of the adoption community now, and we kind of know where do we come from this idea of owning a baby and not having the right of parenting. But so let's go in the past and look at history a little bit, and I'd like to understand the history of the market of babies that developed in Australia, particularly. So Patricia, would you be able to tell us a bit about how that developed in Australia?
Pascal, I think the best reference to get a good history of the development of adoption generally in Australia is to have a look at Quarterly, Swain and Cuthbert's book, The Market of Babies. My research really began really looking at inter-country adoption and its emergence into Australia. Certainly, adoption here emerged like it has in most other Western countries with the stigmatisation of unmarried mothers. But I mean, adoption has existed in all societies through to ancient history. But Indigenous forms of adoption aren't necessarily as we see them today or as we understand adoption processes today. And modern adoption, if you like, really has come about when traditional family structures fall apart, whether that be through industrialisation, war, disaster, and often poverty, or wherever there's movements of people, and traditional ways of looking after children within extended families break down. And that really is a precursor to a lot of modern adoption as we see it now. And certainly where children come from, if we talk about inter-country adoption, it's usually from much poorer families or countries, but not necessarily so. Some countries that do adopt their children are not considered poor countries. Inter-country adoption in Australia has been going on for some decades, and prior to regulation and prior to government-sanctioned adoption programs, individual children were adopted into Australia. Someone's rattling around in the background there, Pascal. Children were adopted into Australia as individuals, usually because adoptive parents worked overseas or formed an attachment with an individual child. But the first real wave of children came into Australia with Operation Baby Lift in 1975 when Saigon fell, and within 2 years the program with South Korea began with the arrival of children on a Qantas plane in December 1977. And so after that point, there have been a number of visits to Asian countries to establish programs. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you very much. Penny, you'd like to add something to that?
Yes, just going back to before the country, I mean, in the late 19th century, there were really too many children born out of wedlock in Australia. The sort of convict history of Australia meant that there were a lot more men than women in white society, and a lot of children were born out of wedlock. And you might have heard, I mean, the baby farmers. There was children born out of wedlock were a problem, and in the late 19th century they were dealt with. People would advertise asking for some kind person to care for their child, and this whole industry of baby farmers developed where they would get rid of the problem, not always by placing the children with another family, often by literally starving the children to death, things like that. So that was a whole thing going on. There wasn't a lot of bureaucracy, of course, and so eventually the governors, etc., had to respond by taking some control of this horrible practice. And they tried, people were still advertising for other families or people to look after the children born out of wedlock, but it was it was private, it was unregulated, it wasn't formal, and eventually orphanages developed to place these children so that they be cared for in a more humane way. And eventually, following that, people realised orphanages weren't the best way to care for children, and adoption started to really take off in a more regulated way. And private adoptions have long been illegal in Australia. However, when in the sort of post-war period, adoption was used to marry up two problems, to deal with the children born out of wedlock, and there were a lot of them coming out of the wars with, you know, servicemen who were going back to their countries, etc., etc. And again, you know, children were still being born out of wedlock. So it was seen as solving the problem, two problems. One of infertile people who couldn't have children, and the other of all their children being born out of wedlock. So that's sort of the background with how then. So, but then what happened was the demand for children became greater than the problem, the so-called problem. And in the 70s, saw so many changes with Gough Whitlam bringing in, you know, supporting parents benefit, so that single mothers could raise their child with a financial, with income. Abortion was made legal, blah, blah, blah. So that's when the demand for children to adopt really increased. And as Patricia went on to say about the setting for inter-country adoption coming into the whole scenario.
Mm.
Okay,
and can I just clarify? Linnell had a comment. Operation Baby Lift was April 1975. It was the start of the Korean program in December 1977, just to clarify.
Vietnam, actually.
Sorry?
Vietnam, not Korea.
No, 1977 was Korea. 1975 was Operation Baby Lift, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'll just move a bit forward and just talk about the drastic drop of adoptions, because people don't realize these statistics, but in around 1970s, it was the high peak of adoption in Australia, and we were having 10,000 of adoptions every year. Now in 1980s, we only had around 1,000 adoptions per year. And as Penny mentioned it a bit earlier, something happened at that period in 1970 for that to happen. So maybe, Patricia, can you talk about this?
The drop in the numbers that we've experienced recently?
Exactly.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot of reasons why countries open their doors, why countries close their doors. We do know from research that countries open their doors to adoption because of the activities of lobbying groups, politicians, pro-adoption influencers who do place pressure on governments to open programs. That's why countries open. No country actually asks for its children to be adopted. Why countries close for adoption, there's lots of different reasons for that, which can range from trafficking to politics, to relationships with other countries, and whether a country becomes a signatory of the Hague Convention or not. Certainly, numbers have dropped because the big sending countries, as a general rule, have reduced the number of children being adopted. For example, South Korea has been our longest running program that has sent the most children to Australia. But that was always a temporary program, according to South Korea, when it commenced, that it was only going to be 2 years, and that slowly extended out. But as as numbers of children from South Korea have lessened, the quotas have got less. Other countries have emerged as big sending countries like China and Ethiopia. So generally the numbers around the world are reducing. More countries are becoming compliant with the Hague Convention, which means certain processes are tightening up. Some countries like South Korea are promoting domestic adoption as a viable alternative, but are also, like we did in the 1970s, introducing some form of income support, though vastly inadequate, for mothers to be able to keep their children. And I might just put in a bit about fathers there, that they're often invisible in the process. So hence people often talk about mothers. So there's a number of reasons. There's increases in domestic adoption. There's looking at other alternatives to care for children. There's recognition of the needs of children for cultural identity and to stay connected with their families rather than be separated from them. And the restrictions really have very little to do with the Australian government. It's actually to do with the sending countries and the children that they are sending or are prepared to send or who are eligible or deemed eligible for adoption.
Thank you, Patricia. I'd just like to add, so Pamela, you are a adoptive mother.
Yes, I adopted a son from Vietnam in 1974. He was 9 months old when we got him. This was just about the time that the baby left and the plane crash and all of that horror. I will have to say that at the time I was, of course, very committed to doing this. I was concerned about the children that American GIs had left behind in Vietnam. I didn't think America was doing enough, if anything, to help those children. And they were in dire straits. At least that was what I was led to understand. So my intention in adopting was not because I couldn't have children. I already had a son. I had already relinquished one son for adoption myself, so I knew adoption from that side. And I guess I felt that maybe by adopting a child myself, I could atone for what I had done in surrendering my first child. But that's a personal thing. I think what we all too often do these days, and when I say we, I mean society in the West, is we think about the needs of the parents. Say an infertile couple who are desperate to have a child, and they have to wait 10 years to get a healthy white infant, so they decide to go abroad and adopt maybe what to them would be a second best, I'm not saying that trans-race or international children are second best, but the priority for most couples would be to have their own child. So any child that comes any other way is going to be down the list, a sort of second tier, if you will, and I think that's a problem. I don't think that adoptive parents' needs should be paramount at all. It should always be about the children, and taking children out of their own country, out of their own culture, depriving them of their language, their ancestry, I think is, to my way of thinking, it's really criminal. I have a very hard time seeing it any other way. I know it's complicated. I love my son, and I'm not sorry that we adopted him. I think he's had a lot of problems. Being a black Vietnamese male in American society has not been easy for him. As you know, I didn't know nearly enough when we got him to provide adequately for the kinds of challenges that he was going to face. And I regret that very much now. And I guess what I would like to do is tell other people who are thinking about doing this, don't think about what you want or what your needs are or how much you want a child. Think about what's best for that child. Would it be better for a child to grow up with people around him who look like him and talk like him and that he feels a part of? I think that's preferable to taking a child out of his culture, plucking him out of what he knows, even if he's young. Babies know the difference, and just plunking him down in an alien culture where he will always be alien. No matter what your good intentions or your love is not enough. This is a bigger issue than that, and it's a bigger issue than just a family getting a child. We're taking a resource from poorer countries because we're rich and we can do it, and somehow that seems, well, imperialistic. An extension of colonialism, if you will. It certainly is taking advantage of poorer people, and I think we need to think very hard about that.
Excellent, thank you, Pamela. I'll let Linnell talk, because she's also a baby from Vietnam, and adoptee from Vietnam. I'm sorry. Linnell, what was your experience in growing up in Australia, in white Australia?
Well, I was adopted into a family like Pamela's, actually. My adoptive parents had children of their own, and they saw a lot of the media coverage of the Vietnam War. I actually came out before Operation Baby Lift, and was adopted into a family that had their own natural-born siblings. So I was the only one out of 5 that actually was adopted and looked different. So my experience in the early 70s in Australia was quite challenging and difficult, because I was adopted into a country area of Australia. Australia at that stage was just, leaving the White Australia policy perspectives era, and so yeah, I experienced a lot of racism, and I was often the only ethnic-looking person in my school, everywhere that I went, actually, until I was 19 and moved to Sydney. So it was quite challenging, and it was interesting to hear Pamela's perspective, at how it was to parent and how she's observed her son's journey, because I think it's fantastic that, we can actually talk openly about adoption today and talk about the fact that it is complex. It's not just about fulfilling the needs of the parents. It is about the child and how that child experiences the complications, the consequences. We had no choice, but yet today we still remain fairly unempowered to actually have any say in policy at the political level, and yet everyone espouses that it's all about us and our needs, but yet they don't really listen to us because they get uncomfortable with hearing the fact that it is complicated. It is not just a happy, lovely, great story about being rescued. It's about the trials and tribulations. It's a journey that's complex, and every adoptee experiences it differently. So I'm not sure how much more you want me to comment about at the moment.
There's one point I'd like to mention, is that I feel like there's adoptive parents at that time that adopted from intercountry weren't ready to face or to accompany their children through racism. They wouldn't know what it feels to be
they had no idea. They didn't. In fact, they were told a lot of the time, from what I've heard from adoptive parents that I've had association with, they were told to, just love the child as your own, and everything will be okay. There was absolutely no preparation, and in still many countries that are receiving countries today, there still is very little preparation, and it depends on the society in which you are adopted into as to how difficult that journey will be, and how much compounding will actually happen on top of the abandonment issues that you are given as a legacy of being abandoned or given up.
So Pamela, so sorry,
yes.
I wanted to ask Pamela if she if she did have any help and or understanding of what her child was living through.
None. No. I'm ashamed to say it, but no. We had no preparation beforehand. This was 1974, and the whole idea of international adoption was still pretty unusual and pretty new. I think I knew one other family that had a Korean baby. So I went into it very naively, thinking that, you know, if I could just have a mixed race family, that would you know, set the world on the path to happy race relations, and love would triumph over everything. And I look at that now and I'm just appalled at my naivete. I was not equipped. We were not equipped to deal with what a black male in America faces. And I did live in Canada when we first got our son. We lived in Canada for 4 years, and it was more multicultural there. And I've often wondered if we had stayed there in that more multicultural environment, this was in a small city outside of Toronto, if maybe things would have been better. But then we moved to the south, to North Carolina, and the racial divide here is pretty extreme. And my son, as a little guy in kindergarten, had to start navigating that and had to decide at some point, am I going to be black? Am I going to be white? What am I? And you know, his friends at school would say, "Why do you talk like a white person? You're black. Why do you sound so white?" Or, you know, who he could date. And finally, when he was probably in his late teens, he said to me one day, he said, "Mom, I'm black. I am black." And he has really joined the black community. He has surrounded himself with African American friends and family, and has moved into that culture. And I think that's good. I'm glad for him that he's done that, because he's, you know, less alone. He was the only adopted child in our family, and we are white as white. And here is my son, who is obviously not one of us. And everywhere we went, grocery stores, restaurants, swimming pools, we stood out. You know, we were that family. And that's a terrible burden to put on a child, I think. I think that's just a lot to ask a child, to deal with that kind of cultural tension.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Pamela. I think Linnell and Penny can add on the fact that the formation is very different. Is different now than what it was then. But I'd like to ask Amy her own experience on growing up here in Australia and with the crisis of identity that you have. Can you comment on that, Amy?
Yeah, so I think, you know, the world knows that Australia is a pretty racist country, and I've definitely experienced it myself. It's a really, really difficult thing, and I think probably not until recently, like even last year, I went back to Korea, and for the first time ever, I was in a city, I was in a country where I could step out the front door and not think, you know, who's going to say something to me today because, you know, I'm Asian. And not that that happens every day, but you do grow up with this sense that it could happen to you. It's like this underlying subconscious thing that you're just worried that someone might say something to you. And I mean, racism is a constant reminder that you don't belong here. But even over in Korea, I guess you don't necessarily belong there either. So it was a really, really strange feeling. But yeah, since then, and probably over the last 3 or 4 years, I've felt like something is different. It's really missing, and it really struck me that the cultural identity thing was a really hard thing. Like, you know, Australia is known for its drinking, and I'm not a massive drinker, so I don't necessarily fit in there. And you know, growing up, all of my friends were white, and you know, you try so hard to assimilate because that's what people do. You never want to be the outsider, so you know, you go along and you're doing really well, and you think, oh yeah. You know, you look in the mirror and sometimes you're actually really surprised that you're Asian, and then it just takes one person to say something about, you know, being, because everyone in Australia, all Asians apparently are Chinese, So, you know, it takes that one person says one thing and that's it. And, you know, it sends you into this really, I don't want to say depression, but you feel it's incredibly distressing, and it's incredibly alarming that you think someone's already drawing attention to the fact that you're not like them. And it's really hard. My family, you know, Dad's Irish, Mum was English. They have a biological daughter who's blonde and blue-eyed. So, you know, that's my reference point. And for me, that's what I am. That's what I look like. You know, I didn't know any other Koreans. I had one Chinese friend. So, you know, it's incredibly hard. There's there's not a lot of resources for you to be able to form a cultural identity. You're a tourist here and you're a tourist there. So it's incredibly difficult.
Thank you, Amy. Joe Sol, who is a psychotherapist, you have dealt with a lot of inter-country adoptees from South Korea. Are you surprised with what statements that Amy has just said?
No, not at all. But I'd like to even add to it. I think that the racism itself that every adoptee from Asia that I've worked with, or outside of the United States actually, you get that look, the look that you know so well, that reminds you that you're not like everyone around you. And my belief is that since losing our mothers was a trauma, every time we get the look, it reminds us that we're not with our mothers. It reminds us of that trauma. And so I think that it's much more insidious than we might be aware of. I cannot imagine how painful that is for Amy and Linnell, for example, to have to put up with that on a regular basis. But I was thinking of something else, and that is that in the beginning you talked about right to parent. A lot of people believe they have the right to parent, and I think it's part of what drives adoption, especially internationally, is that people believe they have a right to a child, and some people will do anything they can to get a child, even if it's taking a child out of their own milieu. So I find it abhorrent.
Yeah, it's very. I have some interesting statistics here. That this year, out of the 57 non-Hague inter-country adoptions, 52 adoptees were of age of 4 and under. And by looking at UNICEF statistics, 95% of all orphans are over the age of 95. This is quite concerning because with the statistic, it shows that adoptive parents are aiming for the infants and not actually the kids that are actually being helped. Penny, you've worked in inter-country adoption programs. Can you comment on that?
Yes, well, most prospective adoptive parents for the inter-country program come to that program because they've been through years of IVF treatment. You know, usually most prospective adoptive parents are infertile. So they might have had years and years of IVF treatment unsuccessful, and maybe with tragedies along the way. Then they've looked into local adoption, realised there are very few children, or they might already be too old because they've stayed with IVF treatment for so long. So they come to inter-country adoption, and it's what Pamela was saying before, that, you know, they want to love that child as if it was their own, as if born to them. So even though it's not this child can never replace a birth child that they never had, that's still what they want. So they want the healthiest possible infant to share all the milestones as if the child was born to them. So that is the group that comes to inter-country adoption seeking to adopt. And they have the best intentions, and they feel often very altruistic that they will be giving an opportunity to a child that wouldn't otherwise have that. But really, it's overlaid with their own needs to have a birth child.
Okay, to be fair, let's talk a bit about the adoptive parents, because to be fair, they have lived through kind of a grief of not being able to have a child of their own, and the hard process of IVF, which is an expensive one, and also very. They are. So, can you comment on that, Patricia?
Yeah, look, it's a really difficult road, and the thing I'd like to say here is it's so good that we can talk about the negative aspects of adoption as well, and I think it's really important for anyone out there who's listening that it's not a criticism of adoptive parents in any way. It's about understanding, not the one-liners and the marketing stuff that we get in the media and by some lobbyists. It's about really fully discussing and understanding what adoption means and not labelling people whose views might challenge us as angry adoptees or other types of comments. And I think a lot of parents actually really do understand that it's a complex thing, and their experience backs that up. So IVF, certainly there are people who have children, as Penny has said, who do adopt, but generally it is because people want to form families, and they come from a system, perhaps 10 years of fertility treatment, where they are the customer, they are the focus, their needs are looked after, and then to shift from a fertility system to an adoption system where they're not the focus. The focus is the children, and it should remain on the children. But that can be a very difficult thing, and it's very easy for people to feel neglected and misunderstood when they make that switch. And it is a process of loss and grief, and it's very difficult for people, and no one can deny that. But it is making that mental shift that adoption is for children. It isn't for the adults involved who want to form families.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's really the shortest answer, I suppose.
Okay, thanks, Patricia. I'd like to talk about a point that you made just right now, because you say that it's important and it's great that we're now being critical about the adoption process. I'd like to understand why we're not hearing any criticism about adoption in mainstream media, and why is it so rare to see any adoptees talk about their own reality? We just hear about adoptive parents' reality. We hear about okay, Linnell, can you tell us why would it be hard for an adoptee to be critical about his or her own adoption?
I guess from where I've had my own personal experience in this, as well as observing other adult adoptees speak out as well, is that, you know, we come from a background of having been abandoned, having been given up, having been rejected. So for us, there's a very core issue of feeling like we're not accepted on some level. So to then go to fast forward, you know, 20, 30 years later, to where we start to talk about, well, actually, I haven't experienced adoption as a glossy story. You know, in fact, I've experienced it as being very hard, very tough, very challenging. I've actually felt quite alone, isolated. You know, a lot of adoptees also will go through mental health issues because of the challenges. And there's just not enough understanding out there. And when we do speak up about the realities of our experience, we are often faced with a lack of compassion, a lack of understanding, and often even labelled, you know, oh, you're just angry, and you're just, you know, you've just had a bad experience, so, you know, we'll kind of push your experience to the side, because we want to hear these stories from adoptees who are happy about being adopted and can just tell us about how wonderful it is. So it is very challenging, because if you dare to stand up, it's like you've got to be prepared to face the consequences that you will get flack back, you will get criticised, and you'll be rejected by the mainstream, who want to just know that adoption is wonderful and a happy ever after story. So I think that's why, at the end of the day, it is hard for us to stand up and say what our reality is. We don't want to experience more rejection. We've had enough, and that is it.
Okay. So Amy, do you feel the same way than Linnell?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point of view. I think for me, when I think about that question, it's all we hear about is how great adoption is and how, all I ever heard was how amazing my adoptive parents must be because they've gone and done this great thing, and everyone just thinks it's really amazing, and how lucky I also have a brother who's also adopted from South Korea, and all we ever hear is how lucky we are to be here because we would have been so poor and grown up so awfully if we were still in Korea. And I think not once have I ever heard that my parents were lucky to have us. And so I think you grow up just thinking, yeah, we are really lucky. And when people ask me about my adoption, I know that I have literally said, I don't mind about being adopted. I'm so lucky to be here. And, I am, and I love being here. I love my life. It's not about that, but it's just, you truly learn to believe that you are better off. But, last year I met my family over in Korea, and I have, a full blood brother and sister, and I remember coming home and I was incredibly angry about not necessarily being here, but I saw how I don't want to say everyone's happy, but they were really happy and compared to me quite well adjusted, and they just seemed very comfortable in their own skin. And I think that really struck home for me about that was probably the first time I ever felt, well, my life, maybe we would have been poor and, lived off rice and only, and all of that sort of stuff, and had all that problem with stigmatized single mothers. But the emotional issues that being adopted brings up, yeah, I think that it made me really angry, and I really grieved for a life that I might have had, where I might have kind of grown up, psychologically a bit more sound than I am now, I think.
Thank you. Joe, do you want to add a comment on this?
Well, I had two thoughts. One is that if I dare say that I'm unhappy being adopted or that it causes me pain, there is at least on some level a fear of being abandoned by my adopted parents because I'm not supposed to say that. And the other level is that the loss of a mother's a trauma. If I acknowledge that pain, then I'm going to have to feel it. And I think it's one of the most terrifying feelings that we have as adopted people, and that many of us cannot touch that pain, and so we say we're fine, without any awareness that the pain exists, because it's too terrifying. And there's a concept called fear of fear, and I think that plays very often in the way we react.
Let's talk about this, because it feels like it's very common for adoptees to have this fear of abandonment and rejection. Would you all adoptees, and I'm talking generally to local adoptees and intercountry adoptees, do you feel that way? Penny, can you comment on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll just reiterate the same sorts of things that Mel and Amy and Joel have been saying about wanting to fit in, not wanting to feel different, and yeah, not wanting to be rejected. You want to belong, even though you don't really quite feel like you do. And I know when I was growing up, a couple of funny things. One was that when I was in grade 6, I was actually bullied by my local primary school children, and I grew up in a rural area of Victoria. Because I was clever at school, people thought, and they knew that my heritage was unknown, and I used to, have the fringe and the fairly squarish hair. People decided I looked like an Asian child, and I'm a local adoptee. My heritage is Celtic Anglo, but people didn't know that then. I didn't know that then, and they assumed that because I was clever at school, only an Asian child. This is a very reverse sort of racist thing. Only an Asian child could be that clever. Penny must have Asian heritage. So that was pretty good. But because my adoptive mother had brown eyes and brown hair, and everybody in our small community knew I was adopted. But they would say things like, "Oh, you're so lucky, you look so much like your parents," like that was a really good thing. But in a way, made it harder to, like, it looked like I fitted in. So it was harder to, it was almost like if there's something wrong with me, am I going mad because I don't feel like I fit in? So those things are very hard. I didn't realise the effect that really my loss of my mother at birth, because I was one of those babies that the sheet was put up when I was born so she couldn't see me and she wasn't allowed to hold me, and I was placed with my adoptive family at 3 weeks. But I didn't realise what impact that loss had on me until I'd had many more losses. A number of people in my adoptive family who were close to me died when I was a child growing up, and then when I was 25, my maternal adoptive grandmother died. 3 weeks later, my adoptive father died very unexpectedly. And then a few years after that, I had twins born prematurely, and they died. And, I fell in the hugest pit, and, for counselling and etc., etc. And it was only through that whole experience that I realised it was this accumulation of losses. And because they were sort of they don't get, nobody when I was growing up talked about the loss of birth parents, because again, we were considered so lucky for having wonderful adoptive family. And I absolutely do love my adoptive parents, always have respected them, but I don't feel lucky for having been separated from my birth family. And I don't feel lucky that the underside of that is that I've never felt confident, I've never felt like I belong with my adoptive family, and now that my both adoptive parents are deceased, I've been left, I feel like I've been abandoned again. And last few years have been quite hard since my adoptive mother died to sort of work out where I fit in with my adoptive family. So I just would reiterate all those comments, and that because you're not allowed to talk about those things in your adoptive family, you don't actually have a chance to deal with them while you're growing up. It's later when big events hit you that you realise that it all comes caving in, and the impact, in fact, in some ways gets bigger, not lesser.
So let's talk to Camilla. Were you ever? Did your son ever tell you about how he felt? Well, did he ever have any criticism, or did he feel like he could be free of talking with you about such things?
No, he hasn't. He's 41 years old now. The son that I relinquished for adoption is 46. I have learned more from my first son about what it's like to be adopted. He's told me a great deal about his childhood, his adoptive family, how he always felt isolated, alone, didn't know what ethnicity he was, felt like a square peg in a round hole for his whole life. He's been very articulate about it. My adopted son, my Vietnamese son, doesn't want to talk about it. I've tried many times to engage him in conversation, to try to get some communication with him about this, even recently, and all he says is, well, yeah, it was tough, but it just, I'm a survivor and it just made me tougher. But he's had a lot of difficulties, a lot of relationship difficulties, problems with the law. He's not had an easy time. And he's in denial, like Joe said. I think he's just too afraid to even allow himself to feel the enormity of what must be raging around inside him. I can't even imagine what he thinks, and I don't think he really knows what he thinks either, because it's so locked down in him. He's very well, as one psychologist said of him at one point when he was just a kid. He said he's one of the best defended personalities that this therapist had ever seen, and he has just shut down and won't engage with his emotions at all, and has had a series of relationships. He's not able to commit to a long-term relationship for any length of time. He's got multiple children with multiple women. He's had a very difficult time, and I have to say, adoption must have a lot to do with that. And I think what my first son has told me about his feelings, I attribute those to my Vietnamese son, and I think, yes, he must feel that way too, even though he can't talk about it.
Okay, let's talk a bit about the fact that, because it seems that it's a pattern between adoptees to feel that way. Maybe not every adoptees, but a lot of adoptees. And so I hear this expression, the angry adoptee, and we dismiss this kind of opinion or feelings of adoptees because perhaps we feel like those adoptees have a bad relationship with their adoptive parents, and we blame it on the adoptive parents, and then we say, oh, this is just a separate case. If an adoptive parent takes care of his adoptive child, then he or she should be happy. Do you think that's the case? The reason why we're dismissing those kind of feelings that adoptees are having, just on the bare fact that we're saying they're angry. So this is a question for everyone.
Can I say something here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I think that everybody does assume that if the adoptee is unhappy, then the adoptive parents must have been bad parents. I don't assume that that's true. I think adoptive parents, for the most part, do love their children and want the best for them, and struggle to give them a good life. But there's just a lot against you when you're trying to make a match between a child and a family that he doesn't fit into. You could be the best parents in the entire world, and it could still be very problematic. So I don't think that it's right to just assume that it's the adoptive parents' fault. If they were just better parents, then the kid would be okay. I don't think that's true.
Okay. Would you have a comment on that, Joe?
Well, I don't see how a woman could ever lose a baby and not hurt. And I think that it goes to say that nobody can lose a mother and not hurt. And I think it go back to it's too painful to touch. I think it's just so terrifying. And this is not about having good parents or not. It's about, I think we need to look at what we lost, not what we got. We could have the best parents in the world, but cannot make up for the loss of a mother, specifically.
Okay, Linnell, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think, I think there is a right to be angry, and it's a shame that we can't include the angry feelings in with all the others. But I also think that, in the bigger picture of adoption, it's about power differentials, and I think this is why I believe it's justified that we should feel angry at some stage in our journey of being adopted, is that, adoption is always about a power differential between the people who end up having to give up the child for whatever reason, poverty or stigma, or versus the people who end up adopting because they've got the wealth and the means and the education and everything that goes with being able to give them the right to be able to have access to that child. So, as an adoptee growing up, when I was younger, in my 18 age, kind of those early years, I didn't feel angry. But it wasn't until I got old enough to understand the bigger picture of adoption that I actually felt angry. And I now, as an adult in my 40s, believe it's justified, because we should be angry that adoption happens too often in cases where there should be better options provided, or there should be more consideration given to the situation, and that adoption should not be bandied around as a band-aid solution for every problem that a country faces or that people face. I mean, there are times and places where adoption should be the right thing, but I think today it's become too common for governments, for countries at that political level, to discuss option as if it's the greatest solution ever. And yes, I think there's a place to be angry about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Amy?
Yeah, Linnell, I completely agree with you. There aren't enough options at all. But I think, the first time I heard of this concept of the angry adoptee, it actually surprised me. Until last year, and for about a week, that was the first time I've ever even been angry about my adoption. I've always kind of been okay with it, tried to understand it, and in the end, I mean, it's happened. What can you do to change it? But I think the more we hear, there's obviously quite a high-profile celebrity in Australia who is very, very much into, reducing all those rules and the time and the laws on getting children adopted in Australia and inter-country adoption as well. And, like for me, I had a pretty terrible childhood. My adoptive parents, really should not have gotten past the screening. Mum was severely mentally unwell. Dad is, let's not even go there. It's just, like I feel like I'm a walking case study for why those laws should be incredibly stringent. And, so it's about, by the time children even get here or get to the point where they need to be adopted, I think, that's really a conversation we need to be having as well. So it's not even about being angry or even being given up. It's there are so many factors in play here at the moment that will make you angry, and it's not just about not being heard. I think adoption is still very much looked at probably way too positively in this country.
Thank you. Penny, you wanted to add something about this.
Oh, I've got so many things I could add here, but I'll start with the angry bit. I never felt angry about being adopted. I guess because as a social worker, well, having had a good experience with growing up in my adoptive family and studying social work, I understood the societal things going on which led to my adoption. There have been points when I felt incredibly sad about it. One of those was when I searched for my maternal family after my twins died, and my adoptive mother was very unhappy and upset about that, which surprised and shocked me because she'd always been open about my adoption and about what she knew or said she knew about my family. So that was a point at which I was very sad, and I was in my mid-30s then. I never felt angry about being adopted until the 19th of December 2013. That was when new Prime Minister Tony Abbott announced that he was going to make it much easier, faster, and as it turns out also cheaper for Australians to adopt children from overseas. And I thought, what is going on? 9 months previous to that, there was a national apology for forced adoption in March 2013 by the then Prime Minister Julia Gillard, which had come after a great deal of work, learning, for politicians basically to learn about all the terrible unethical practices that had gone on before the 1980s in terms of adoption. And of course, inter-country adoptive young adults and groups supporting them were seeking to have their circumstances acknowledged in that apology too. So in the space of 9 months, we've gone from acknowledgement of the terrible wrongs done to so many people with unethical adoption practices in this country, almost got national acknowledgement that similar things had happened overseas and with children who'd been adopted to here. And on the basis of no new evidence, no new information, on the basis of a public repopularisation of adoption, our new Prime Minister was saying we're going to make adoption easier. And it, by the way, it's all about family formation, not about the needs of the children. So that was the first time I ever became angry. And that, I am angry now. I am angry, and I've only been angry for a year, if you like. So, yeah.
Okay, so Penny, I'd like to highlight a little something here, because I think there's a lack of understanding that what's happening sometimes in some countries for inter-country adoption is a bit similar to what happened in the forced adoption era in Australia. where mothers didn't have enough resources, social and financial resources, to keep their child, and there was this stigma upon those women, saying that they were prostitutes, being unmarried and having kids, and those social attitudes changed in Australia, and therefore we have less kids up for adoption now. Is it the same thing that is happening overseas? Patricia, can you comment on that?
Look, certainly there are a set of different circumstances in every sending country, but most certainly the people who lose their children to adoption are poorer, have access to less resources. There is stigmatisation in some cultures with unmarried mothers. South Korea, for example, there's wonderful work being done by Korean adoptees who've returned to Korea supporting mothers, and some adoptive parents are also doing the same. But their circumstances are very similar to what has happened in forced adoptions in Australia. And there's no two ways about that. I read something on the internet yesterday about, oh, but they had a choice. Well, no, not really. But choice for us is very different, and we need to be very aware of our own dominant positions and our own positions of wealth and power in determining what choice is. People often have very little choice when it comes to inter-country adoption. And I would like to just say one thing, that we're human beings and we tend to agree or accept with those worldviews that matches our own. And anyone involved with inter-country adoption or any other issue, we need to learn to be critical and to question what we're told. How do we know that's true? All the stuff, all the mythology that's spread around in the media, in politics about this issue, how do we know that that's true? Just because someone says that doesn't mean it's true. And if we all have a critical view, we respect everybody else's experience and opinions, we can have more of these conversations and have deeper understandings of what these issues are really about. And we need to ask, how do we know that's true just because someone told us? So that maybe didn't answer your question, Pascal, but I think it's a very important point.
Very, very important point. And that's actually the aim of this talk, is to stimulate people to talk about adoption as something that can be criticized. It might not always, we're not automatically saving children in other countries or saving children in our own. And we have to think about other options as well, because if we know that it causes so much trauma and dissociation to all of these adoptees, we can't, I don't think it looks like we can't continue doing that forever. So let's. It's been an hour we've been talking, and I think it's time to conclude. So I'd like to just thank everyone. Does someone want to add something before we conclude and pass to the question section?
No, I don't. But we've all touched on huge issues, and each of these are huge issues. It'd be great to talk about each of these in more depth. Yeah.
No. I'd like to continue a little bit more if you'd like to as well. Can we continue 15 more minutes? Is everyone okay with that? Sure? Great.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask this question. What does adoption legally imply, and what are the other options available in Australia?
For people to have families?
No, just adoption in general, because it feels like there's, it feels like to care for a child, it needs to go through adoption.
Yeah, look, adoption means the legal, the social, and often the geographical separation from your family, your parents, your family, and your community. So it's a serious matter, and it should never ever be taken lightly. And we should never ever ever support adoption-driven systems. Now, that's not saying adoption is bad, and that's not saying that we don't have adoption. What that is saying is an ideological position that adoption is the only answer, should never drive a service, should never drive an approach to welfare, because there are other alternatives. And with adoption, we look at the individual aspects, we look at individual children, and we don't look at those broader systemic issues that actually cause children to be separated from their families in the first instance. And one of the things that concern me, and Australia needs a hell of a lot more dialogue on this before we follow the UK, is the emergence that was first flagged politically by politicians in about 2005, that adoption is the answer to children in care. It's not that simple. And UK is in a bit of a mess as a result of the direction that they've been going, and there are siblings being separated, there are siblings having years of discussion about finding a family for you. That's a whole different kettle of fish. But when one source of children dries up, human nature, we look for another. And that's another discussion for adoption again, that there are alternatives, and we need services, and we need a focus on what do families need to stay together in the first instance. And that's not saying adoption for some children is a bad thing. What it's saying is it's not the only thing, and it should never drive our approach to children.
Thank you very much. So let's quickly look at the questions that we have. I don't think that many people have asked any question. Meanwhile, while I look at that, I'd like to talk quickly about, let me see. Yeah, so let's introduce a little bit about next week's talk, because there's this new concept called open adoption, and this year 89% of all local adoption were open. Can we define what is an open adoption and why it was created? Sorry, it's not a new concept. Sorry, but why is it more preferred than adoption in, at the moment? Closed adoption, sorry.
Penny, do you want to answer that, or shall I?
Yeah. Well, I could certainly have a go. Pascal, the open adoption was created or modified from adoption because it was acknowledged that children they have a right to have knowledge about their history and to have contact where possible with their family. Not only is it a right, but it was based on all the psychological evidence that children, for their identity development throughout their life, not just the children and their well-being, they need to have this information. So it was thought that by modifying adoption, making it open, would overcome that. However, there's an inherent tension in open adoption, and that is that adoption is built on erasing the child's legal identity, severing their legal relationships with their family of origin. And even though open adoption is supposed to enable ongoing, limited, structured contact, if you like, with family of origin, the fact is that the adoptive parents have all the legal power as they did before open adoption was invented. So at any time, the adoptive parents can say, oh, this contact is upsetting the child. I don't think it's in the child's best interest. I think we better stop that. So at the end of the day, even adoptive parents who go into open adoption with the best of intentions and an understanding all the research that that they're educated in about how important it is to their child's ongoing psychological and physical well-being, for that matter, there are many points at which they can stop that contact. And if indeed the support services aren't there to support them in maintaining constructive contact with family of origin, that's exactly what happens. And that's the trouble. and we complain about it in Australia, that there aren't the level of support services required to maintain that contact. Now that's why permanent care was also developed, to overcome those problems. And that's why practitioners in adoption and permanent care know that permanent care orders in Victoria, for example, are a much better option than adoption, because there's an assumption that the court mains some level of intervention, and there is some level of oversight and some level of service, although, again, I don't think the money is put in to ensure that it happens well. So to me, open adoption, and it's been around now since the 80s, is really still messing with a broken concept of changing the child's whole identity. Children need security and stability until they're 18 or until they're adults. Adoption is permanent, lasts the duration of the child's life. So therefore, permanent care and orders similar to that are always going to be more in the child's best interest than adoption, which is more in the adoptive parent's interest.
Oh, Penny?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the case with everyone. So yes, can you repeat what you were saying?
I think there are very few cases of where children need to be adopted, i.e. to have their legal links severed with their birth family, because with their family of origin. Your parents that bore you, they don't stop being the people who created you just because of a legal tie. For example, if marriage involved the severing of a person's legal links with their family, nobody would ever want to get married. It would only be under duress or in exceptional circumstances. So why, if a child is going to be placed with parents who are going to care for it in a stable, secure, environment until they're young adults, do they need to have their identity changed to enable that to happen? And that's what that's the premise of adoption.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here by a lady called Catherine Lynch. She says, when considering things like disinheritance and forced movement between countries of adoptees, do you think it would be more successful to campaign for the banning of adoption entirely, or do you think there is an opportunity to so change adoption that it no longer feels like the depriving of our rights to inherit of our family, our rights to remain in our own country?
Me?
So I don't know if someone can comment on that. Penny, you had your talk, so I'll allow.
I think I might answer part of that. I'm not sure I understand the question totally, but there needs to be a focus on more than just removing children. There also needs to be a focus on what is happening in this community, what is happening with this family. For many researchers around the world in a number of disciplines have pointed out that even a fraction of the energy and resources that we put into promoting adoption, if it could go towards the real issues, which is the issues that separate families in the first place, that a lot of change can happen. And so how do we build capacity in these families? How do we build capacity in these communities? What are the reasons that children are being separated? Often it's because there's no school. Often it's because there's no access to medical care. There's a big focus on special needs children and children with medical issues now. But that's because children end up in orphanages with disabilities because there's no support for families with children with disabilities. They can't access medical care. They can't access let alone allied health help. They can't access medical care, and we see that with the baby hatches in China. Those children, if they had access to health care and medical care, things would be different for them. So we need a focus on that as well. But I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but certainly policy needs to also include that aspect.
I'd like to know if anyone else shares that kind of same attitude on the panel on solutions or how to tackle these kind of the problems in overseas. Lynelle, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I'd certainly like to add that there's no international law that prosecutes people for doing the wrong thing, for removing and obliterating children's identities. You know, I mean, there was a famous American case of Giuliano where it was without a doubt she was trafficking children, and yet, you know, the biggest problem with the Hague Convention for inter-country adoption is that there's it's all great talk, but there's no action. So that when you get a person who is totally doing the wrong thing and removing children's identities on purpose, they can't be prosecuted. It's not a criminal act. It's not considered criminal. So the rights of the child are absolutely not protected at all. There is nothing that legally, you know, helps us to stop that kind of adoption from happening. And that's where it all gets quite messy and controversial.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, there is a lot of corruption, and can we just mention a little bit about the corruption if some people aren't aware at home? Do you have any examples?
The corruption involved?
Yeah, corruption. Because here I have a little.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to many inter-country adoptees who have been trafficked, who have been stolen from their birth families. The problem they have is that there is absolutely no support once they're adopted, because you're legal, you know, you legally belong to your adoptive parents. You know, for instance, I have an Indian adoptee who's now in her 20s who just has nowhere to turn. There's no support, there's no financial help. She knows, she has memories of her family, but yet both countries, the sending and the receiving, just kind of go, oh, sorry, you know, there's nothing we can do, too bad. And that is the biggest problem with adoption, where it legally severs your right, even as a citizen, to your birth country. You have no right to go back to that birth country and say, hey, I want this investigated. You know, I actually remember my birth family. I was not abandoned. I was stolen. And yet there's nothing, it almost seems like there's nothing that can be done. And that to me is just purely wrong. You know, we should not be doing adoptions that allow that kind of situation to occur. And it happens too often, in my opinion.
Yeah,
and I think that's also about a lack of political will. Sorry for jumping in, but I think that's also a lack of willingness on behalf of governments and politicians and lobbyists to actually look at that, because that mars the image that this is a perfectly acceptable practice always, and it's not always an acceptable practice. And look, children are stolen, children are trafficked across borders, parents are told lies, parents are enticed by promises of education and a better life who do not understand. Parents don't speak the language that they're spoken to. Recruiters go out in some countries to the countryside to recruit. But I'm in the middle of a post-adoption support study, and I don't think there's one person I've talked to who has gone back and looked at their records that have found their records are accurate. So it's not even the cases of being stolen, it's also the false documentation that is around what history adoptees do have. And until receiving countries start to demand accuracy and proper recording and proper processes in sending countries, that is going to always be an issue.
Thank you. I have another question here. This question here, it's also by Catherine Lynch. It seems that she's being really asking all the questions here. So, from where do I start? Where does it start? It starts here. How can this idea that it's vital for the infant to be close to the birthing mother run so parallel with the conviction that babies attach just as well to a strange woman? What is this blackout in awareness that Nancy Verrier so termed in our social society? Can we decide as a society once and for all whether removing babies from the birthing mother is something okay or something incredibly cruel?
Who wants to speak to that? I will if nobody else will.
No.
Go ahead, Pamela. I think that's more for you to answer.
I'm very aware of Nancy Verrier's work, and I have a great deal of respect for it. There are those pro-adoption types who question the validity of the idea of the primal wound, the idea that there's a trauma when a baby is taken from its mother. I have lived adoption. I have lost a son to adoption, and I know from my own experience that yes, it is a terrible trauma. It is a trauma for the mother, certainly. It's a trauma for the baby, and it's a permanent wound. I think science will prove it definitively one day, but certainly common sense and common humanity would tell you that it is a real thing. If you look at baby ducks or baby lambs or kittens, we see bonding going on in the animal world all the time, and we assume it without question. Why then would human beings be any different? Yes, a child can attach to a strange person, but it's not going to be the same. The experiments done with monkeys show that, you know, if a monkey baby is given a choice between a wire monkey or a cloth-covered monkey in place of its real mother, it will go for the cloth-covered monkey as the best substitute. So a child will make the best of it if that's all he can do. But the wound is there, the trauma is there, and it is lifelong, it is lasting, and we simply have to address it and acknowledge it and stop denying, you know, what the industry that's making billions of dollars out of adoption don't want us to know.
Okay, Joe,
Yeah.
I'd like you to comment about this.
True bonding begins in the womb. It's a psychological and physiological process. You can only bond with the person who brings you into this world. And in the words of, and no one can give you that other than your first mother. In the words of Anna Freud, the horrors of war pale beside the separation of mother and child. I think people don't like what Nancy Verrier says because there's so much truth in it that they can't tolerate it.
All right, thank you, everyone. I think this is where we're going to conclude because we've went over 30 minutes after this conversation. So I'd like to thank everyone in the panel to have shared their experiences, and quite heavy ones, share their lives and their experiences, professional experiences, sorry, on the subject. For the next panel, we'll be talking about open adoption, its constructions, and we'll also have a little bit of criticism and an open discussion about it. So if ever anyone at home is wanting to participate to this panel or is involved in open adoption, please message me at asifborn2@gmail.com, and we'll keep in contact. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.